Hi there, my name is Brian, and today I wanted to make a video kind of walking you through my thinking when it came to a recent purchase of solar panels. Um, thought just walking through what I've learned in this process and how I kind of approached it might help others. So first, a little bit about why I decided to go with solar. Um, I had two main objectives. Honestly, the primary objective for me is the environmental impact. As a relatively affluent suburban dweller, I am aware that I am both, in the relative minority of folks who produce or who have a very large carbon footprint personally, and also have an opportunity to do something about that. And so I felt a bit of a obligation to explore solar. I also live in Texas. I have a large roof with lots of sun exposure, and so I'm kind of uniquely in position, I think, for solar to make a lot of sense. So that was kind of the primary objective for me, is to reduce my carbon footprint. Um, but another advantage that was kind of driven home for me as a Texan last year was our winter storm and our grid instability during that period. And so the idea of being able to produce my own power and use that as a backup is also quite compelling. And I'll talk a little bit more about backups in more detail. But one thing to just note about the backup idea when it comes to solar is that, with one exception, and I'll show that right here, for the most part, in order to use your solar panels when the grid is down, you need to have a battery. The reason for that is basically that if there was a damaged line or something, that's why you're disconnected, then there may be workers working on the line expecting the line to be dead because the grid is down. But if there's some random house nearby producing energy and putting that onto the grid, you could electrocute the worker. And so whenever you have a solar system hooked up to the grid and the grid goes down, the solar system is shut off by a requirement for safety reasons. You can get around that, though, if you have a battery system. That adds a lot of circuitry as well as a storage place to hold energy that allows for you to basically form a local kind of power grid that's disconnected from the grid and has its own kind of stable energy source through the solar panels plus the battery, and can basically function disconnected from the grid. Now, the reason I have the IQ8 microinverters from Enphase on screen here is that there's technically now a way to use your solar power when the grid is down without a battery, and that is by using these IQ8 microinverters combined with some additional circuitry that Enphase provides, which costs several $1,000s. And basically, in this situation, what you can use, you can form a microgrid locally that is being fed energy even without a battery. It's disconnected from the grid, and you can have that power a few kind of critical circuits in your home as long as the sun is shining. So that's pretty cool. The ability to have some backup power from your solar panels without a battery had previously not been possible, so that's kind of neat. But it is worth noting that you're going to be at the mercy of whatever energy your panels can provide in that moment. So if a cloud comes over or something, then you're going to have a dip in energy, and whatever you're powering could randomly shut off and stuff. So it's not going to be like a robust or stable backup scheme, but it is, interesting at least that is technically possible now. And while a few $1,000s is not a small amount of money to add that capability, especially given how kind of marginally useful it might be, that's still a lot less than a battery, which I'll talk about more later. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the environmental benefits of solar in a little bit more detail, because in Texas we have, it's not half yet, but we have a rising amount of our energy grid being powered from renewables. Wind is a significant component. And so you might say, well, if my grid is going fairly renewable anyway, let's say I have 50% of my energy coming from renewables, is it really worth putting solar panels on to get that to 100% or 80%, 90%, whatever? And I would argue that it is. And the reason for that is that you have to think about how these different energy sources work. So renewables are basically not controllable energy sources. The utility provider can't ramp up wind production or solar production to meet demand. It is what it is. And so these are highly variable and not really controllable energy sources. Nuclear is sort of in a similar boat in that it is not very flexible. It's basically kind of an on or off system. And so it also doesn't really fluctuate or get scaled up or down to meet demand. And that leaves coal and especially natural gas. And natural gas tends to be the energy source that is used to kind of adjust to meet demand. And so you can scale up or down natural gas power production pretty flexibly with fluctuations in the supply from other sources like renewables and the fluctuations in demand. And so what that means is when you add solar panels to your roof and you basically say, I no longer need energy from the grid, the thing that will basically scale down to compensate for that reduction in demand is natural gas. And so the more people that put solar panels on the roof in a typical kind of grid like Texas is, it's probably natural gas that is going to make up the difference, or scale down to make up the difference. And so you can kind of think of your solar panels as directly offsetting natural gas energy production. And I think this is true in a lot of places. There may be some places that have other forms of energy storage or variable, more renewable variable energy sources. But even in highly renewable energy markets, I think natural gas tends to be the more flexible energy source. So something to think about if you're kind of on the fence due to the fact that your local grid is becoming renewable. I think adding it to your roof is still makes a lot of sense environmentally. And I'll also point out too that if your energy provider might have an option for you to pay a little extra for renewable energy, but there again, unless they're actually building more solar panels to meet that demand, you might just be stealing renewable energy from the rest of the grid. So, yes, it's maybe a good thing to kind of help incentivize more renewables, but it's not necessarily really making a difference in terms of the total carbon emissions of the grid. So something to keep in mind if you're concerned about the kind of environmental justifications. So the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is metering, the way that different energy utility providers bill solar customers. So for a long time, net metering was the primary regime, and I think the reason probably was both a combination of it was simple to implement for the providers, and it also was very customer friendly. So it was popular, and it incentivized solar installation. And the way that net metering works is basically they would sum up your total energy consumption and your total energy overproduction, whatever energy your solar systems would produce in excess of what you would use at that moment, which would go onto the grid. And they would basically just bill you for the net. So if you, over the course of a year, produced the same amount of energy as you consumed, regardless of when you produced that versus consumed it, you would basically have a $0 bill because it would directly offset. So effectively with net metering, what you're doing is you're technically selling energy, you're giving energy to the grid, because there are times during the day when you're producing more than you're using, but then you're going to basically get credit or get the ability to use that same amount of energy later on without paying for it, because you got a credit for putting it on the grid earlier. So you're basically getting retail price for your energy production up to the total, as long as it doesn't exceed your total consumption. If you produce more energy overall, you'll get paid for that, but you'll get paid a lot less. But up until that kind of perfect balance of production and consumption, you're getting retail value for your energy, for your solar power energy. The problem with that is, from a utility perspective, they're basically still having to do all the things to maintain your transmission lines, to maintain your meter, to bill you, all the things that go into having an electric customer. they still have those costs, and yet you're basically not paying them anything if you're one of these solar customers. And so it didn't make a huge difference when solar was in its infancy, but now that more people have solar, this is becoming a significant issue because you've basically got a bunch of freeloaders who are getting the benefits of grid connections without actually paying for it. And so a lot of utilities are moving away from that and moving toward something called feed-in tariffs or instantaneous net metering, where effectively you can't use them as a battery anymore. What they're going to do basically is they're going to install two measurements, 2 meters, if you will, one for the power that you're using and one for the power that you're putting onto the grid, and those are going to have different rates. So you're going to pay more for the energy you get from the grid than they're going to pay you for the energy you give them. So this is just unfortunate for the solar customer because it means they're not getting retail value for their excess energy that they produce at any given moment. And so it cuts into that kind of value proposition or the financial payoff calculation of solar by a decent amount. I'm showing right now the kind of the breakdown for my energy provider, and you can see down here, this is what they're going to pay me for my energy, and the sum of this is what I'm going to pay for energy. And so, my retail price is this, which is something like 9 cents per kilowatt hour, and they're only going to pay me 5 cents. So that's unfortunate, but I do kind of understand from their perspective why they're making this change. So what are some ways to kind of mitigate this, or how does this affect a system design? So the first thing to kind of just observe is that if you are going to buy a battery anyway, a battery can be beneficial in this situation, because effectively the issue is that during the day, and this is a chart of my energy consumption for a recent day. Each of these is a 15-minute interval, and it's showing the kilowatt hours produced. So you can see, during the day, this is temperature. When the temperatures are rising during the day, my AC is coming on, and then it's turning off and coming on. And if you kind of use this temperature graph or line as a kind of a proxy for solar production, I don't have solar panels yet, but if I did, this would be approximately when they're producing energy. You can see that basically, there are going to be times when I'm using a lot of energy to run my AC, and maybe I'm using most or all of my solar production. But then there's going to be times when the AC is off, and I'm using a lot less energy. And during those periods, I'm going to be producing an excess. And so without any sort of batteries, I don't have a place to put that excess. And so I have to sell that to the grid. And without net metering, I'm going to get, 5 cents for that energy, which I'm going to then have to pay for later in the evening when my panels aren't producing, and I pay 9 cents for that energy. So a battery can kind of help offset that because it gives you a place to put that excess energy that you're producing in these intervals during the day to then use later at night and basically not have to pay for that energy. So a battery on-prem basically serves the same purpose that the grid would serve in a net metering regime. The problem is batteries are expensive. A typical single kind of home battery is 10 to 13 kilowatt hours, and you're probably going to use more than that over the course of the night. So a single battery probably isn't going to be enough. You're probably going to need multiple if you really want to kind of not sell any excess solar to the grid. And now you're looking at probably, more money spent on batteries than you spend on your solar system, the solar array itself, maybe. But again, it does, if you're thinking about batteries anyway for the backup value, this is another argument in favor of batteries if you don't have net metering. They can provide you some financial benefit, even though it's almost certainly not going to be enough to pay for the battery. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I also want to just kind of briefly note how the lack of net metering, if you don't have enough batteries to store all of your excess and shift that to the evening, let's say you just go with a single 10 kilowatt hour battery, what that might mean for your system design is that you want to actually underspec it a bit. So under net metering, kind of the goal is to get to 100% of your demand covered by your solar panels. But without net metering, you need to be a little bit smarter, because if you do that, you're going to end up selling a bunch of energy for less than you're going to buy it later. And so kind of the way I've been thinking about it is I probably want to target something less than 100% of these peaks. So like when my AC is running during the day and my solar panels are producing, I probably want to produce less than 100% of that demand. And the reason for that is that I'm going to have this battery. So in the morning, my battery will be dead because I'll have used it up over the night. And I'm going to start charging it when the solar panels start producing. And what I want to do is basically use that battery, like basically let's say that battery gets full maybe halfway through the day. At that point, my battery is not serving any value. I'm just saving that that energy for later in the day or for the night. So what would be ideal is if I actually need a little bit of that battery throughout the day, so that I basically am charging it, but also using enough of it that it doesn't really get to 100% until my solar panels are basically shutting down for the day. So I have basically 100% of battery to use over the night, but I can use some of that storage throughout the day to kind of cover these peak demand periods. And so I want to basically overproduce during the day by about the capacity of my battery. And this will also affect maybe the layout of your solar panels. So, in a net metering regime, you didn't really have to think about that. You could just optimize for total, production, and it didn't matter when. But in this kind of approach where you're using a battery, you might want to kind of bias your production a little bit toward the morning, to kind of get some energy into that battery, and then kind of spread it out roughly evenly, I guess, throughout the day, if you can. And this is tricky. You're not going to be able to do this perfectly, but it's an argument to kind of think a bit smartly about your solar panel layout, so you have some coverage starting from morning all the way to evening, which could mean putting panels on a couple sections of your roof, as opposed to just whatever the maybe optimal section is for total production. Another thing I did want to kind of mention too, which I think is kind of interesting, is that electric vehicles are a little bit unique in that, unlike most other forms of energy demand that you might have throughout the day, you can be smart about when you charge your electric vehicle. And so you can basically say, I want to charge my car during the day. This assumes you have your cars parked at home. If you have a commute and both of you have EVs and both of you commute, then this isn't an option. But if you have an electric vehicle sitting in your garage during the day most of the time, you can choose to charge it then. And so that can justify speccing your solar array up to include the amount of energy you would be putting into an EV in a typical day. So let's say you have a 10 kilowatt hour battery and you also expect to put 10 kilowatt hours into an EV, then you can basically size your system to be approximately whatever energy you would use during the producing time of day, plus 20 kilowatt hours for the battery to recharge and for your EV to recharge. So something to consider if you're planning to get an EV. You can factor that into your solar spec. But again, you may not end up going with 100% of your total production if you don't have net metering, because that won't be as financially beneficial to you. Of course, there's still the environmental argument. If you are okay with paying a premium to just have the peace of mind that 100% of your energy is being produced by solar, then by all means, please do that. But I'm just saying, financially speaking, you might need to be a little bit less aggressive with the size of your system if you don't have a net metering regime. But again, EVs, charging them during the day can alleviate that a decent amount. So that's something to think about. All right, let's talk a little bit more about storage then. So I mentioned kind of, typical storage batteries, 10 to 13 kilowatt hours. The Powerwall is the one everyone knows about. Enphase is another big player in the solar kind of technology space. They have a decent battery. One thing to kind of note is, energy capacity is kind of the main top line spec, and that's how much storage they can store, and that's obviously important. But another important specification is the output power. This basically tells you how much of your home you can power at any given time. And basically what this amounts to is whether or not you can include your AC system and things like maybe your pool pump in what you back up off the battery. Generally speaking, this one IQ10 battery from Enphase does not produce enough instantaneous power to fire up an AC system, plus other things on your grid. And so typically the installers are not going to let you include your AC system in your backup circuit if you go with this battery by itself. Now, if you got two of them, then yeah, you'd probably be okay. Whereas the Powerwall is a bit more expensive, but it does have like basically double the almost double the power production. And so in many cases, a single Powerwall is enough to power your AC and basically back up your whole house. So that is an advantage for the Powerwall, although there's also issues with supply of those. They are becoming it's becoming hard to get a Powerwall if you're not Tesla, if you're not buying solar from Tesla themselves. So that's an issue. It sounds like Enphase may be coming out with some new batteries coming up that may have better specs, so something to keep an eye out for. In both cases, though, batteries, for the home are just not going to pay for themselves. You shouldn't think of them that way. Again, if you don't have net metering, a battery can provide some financial benefits, but basically you need to think about it from the perspective of the peace of mind that having the ability to back up your home provides. And so that's kind of the way to think about it. Quick note, if for whatever reason the battery you're going with can't power your AC, that doesn't mean you can't use it as a backup. It just means that your installer is going to have to basically create what's called a critical load panel that is going to separate out your kind of your biggest power draws, like your AC circuit, from the circuit that is able to be backed up by your battery. And so if you have like a portable AC system, maybe that's totally fine, in which case these lower power batteries are probably fine. So yeah, that's mainly what I want to say about storage. I do want to talk about one quick thing though, which is coming up at some point. It's hard to say when, but it's looking like something called vehicle to home or vehicle to grid is going to become a thing here not too long, in the not too distant future. So what this effectively means is, and we're starting to see kind of some steps in this direction from some of the newer electric vehicles. So Hyundai and Kia, Rivian, Ford, all now have EVs that have basically just a plug that you can use to power things like appliances in your home or whatever off of your electric vehicle's battery, which, just for some comparison purposes, like an EV battery is typically more 60 or more kilowatt hours. So you're talking about a lot of battery capacity in your car just sitting there if it's in your garage most of the time. And it would be great to be able to tap into that for backup purposes, as well as for kind of spreading that usage throughout the day if your car is sitting in the garage most of the time. And so right now there's kind of there are cars that have the basic ability to do some backing up, like a generator, where you just have an extension cord and you hook up some fridges to it. But with vehicle to home and vehicle to grid, that's going to become much more sophisticated, where it's sort of integrated into the charger, and basically it supports bidirectional charging. So you can basically have a system that is smart enough to use your car like it would use a home battery. And to me, that's kind of the holy grail, because at that point, you're using a battery you already have that in many cases is sitting in the garage most of the time, and you're able to get kind of the ability to load shift or shift solar energy to the night, which is great if you don't have net metering, as well as a substantial amount of backup capacity. And if you have two EVs and you have one EV serving this purpose and another one that's just sitting there charged all the time, then I think you're in a great situation as far as a backup standpoint. So that's really, I think, the thing to be looking toward and looking forward to, and it's just really a question of when it happens. I don't think it's going to happen next year, but in the next few years we might start to see some EV models and some charging options that support all of this. And if we can hold out for that, I think that would be a much better approach than buying a home battery, even though, I am still considering one just for the peace of mind in the meantime. Final thing I wanted to talk about real quickly is the legislation in the U.S. around solar tax credits. So as of right now, the tax credit for projects that complete in 2022 is 26%, and that's going to go down to 22% next year in 2023 before phasing it being basically gone. This can be applied to solar projects as well as batteries, as long as the battery is completely charged from solar. However, as of just recently, it sounds like there might be hope that legislation will pass that will basically restore this to the earlier 30% tax credit, and that will apply to projects finished in 2022 through 2032. And so what that basically means to me is that there's really no reason not to move forward on a solar project from a tax standpoint right now, because if the project finishes in this year and the legislation does not pass, then you get the 26% before it goes to 22%. And if the legislation does pass, then you're going to get 30% because that applies to projects starting at the beginning of being completed from the beginning of 2022. So that's something to keep in mind on the timing front. Another thing I just wanted to kind of mention on the timing topic, with solar, because the equipment lasts so long, like 20, 30 years is what we're looking at here, you basically can see every additional year that you get to use the system is essentially free energy. If you're going to pay the money anyway, then it doesn't really make sense to delay, because every additional year you can use it is free energy essentially. Yes, you can say, well, maybe the prices will come down, and they certainly have come down a lot in the past, though right now the prices have stabilized, if not gone up a bit, due to inflation and supply chain constraints. I could also see in the nearer term, at least, the restoration of the 30% tax credit boosting demand for solar panels at the same time that we've seen some producers like LG exit the market. And so we may not see solar panel prices come down significantly in the near term. And so I think that's an argument for not delaying. And then the final thing that I'll mention on the timing front is just the fact that having solar on your house is a hedge against energy cost increases in the future. So if you're producing your own energy at a rate that was locked in by the price of your system, then you're not as affected by changes in global market demand for, say, natural gas, which could be increasing as Europe looks to buy more natural gas from us by investing in liquefied natural gas infrastructure. The U.S. has been sort of on an island when it comes to the natural gas market, because there's not a lot of connections between us and other markets. But if that changes as a result of Europe looking to get gas from places other than Russia, that could drive up demand for natural gas significantly, which eventually could also drive up supply, but that's a concern. And if you're living in a market like I am in Texas, where demand is growing just through population growth, I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that energy prices will be going up, not down, and so this is a way to hedge against that. So I hope that was all useful and interesting. So thanks for watching, and take care.